Did anybody get down to the art museum? Nice show. One person did. I like that show. Good, good. And you guys did? Great. And some of you might have walked into the wardrobe, and you've been away for the last 10 years or so. Just now returning without us even realizing. Just a couple of practical things before I turn the podium over to the moderator for this session. First is, please don't neglect these. If you have anything to give us feedback on that would be helpful for us, whether that's about practicalities or content or format, whatever it might be, we'd be grateful for your responses. Last year, we got one of these back, and it said, more tea options, please. So they go in, there's a little gray box in the just out on the table just outside. So use that, please. Yeah, and so, I hope you've enjoyed the nice tea selection this year. Yeah, good. So thank the person who offered that feedback, and think of what a gift you could be to next year's group by offering feedback as valuable or perhaps even more valuable than that. Yeah, any Westmont person can collect these from you as well. The other thing I'll just point you to, on the book table there and outside is a little pamphlet that the Gady Institute has available called Before You Choose a College, Choose an Education. Okay, now I have to admit that I'm a little sheepish about this now, because this is basically an apologetic for liberal arts education. And it's designed really for students in high school. Somebody was mentioning at the last session that we need to get down below the college level and start to talk to people earlier. And that's really what this is meant to do. It's meant to talk to high school students. In particular, we've got a program here that uses this book that's geared toward first-generation students, low-income students, students of color, who might be being directed toward very practical higher education options and potentially away from the apparently impractical liberal arts. And this tries to show that the liberal arts aren't as impractical as they might seem. But the last session has just made me a little sheepish now. I'm thinking, okay, all of my work is resulting in the continued sex segregation of higher education by promoting this self-actualizing education. So anyway, you're free to take these if you can do so with a clean conscience. And we have thousands of these, so if these seem, yeah, here you go, right there, you can have one. If they seem helpful, ask us for more. The same goes for the bound publications of previous years' talks. Take those, and if any of them seem helpful for any purposes you might have on your campus, for example, faculty development programs, or maybe to put in the hands of students, we've got lots of all of those, and we can send them to you at basically the cost of shipping. So give us a holler for those. You can just visit the Gady Institute website to find those. That's westmont.edu, and then the lower left column, you'll find a link to the Gady Institute. Okay, that's all the practicalities for this session. So here to moderate and also contribute to our panel in this session is Westmont Professor of Communication Studies, Dr. Omedi Ochieng, who was introduced to you previously. But Omedi, please take over.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our session, Gender Studies in Theory and Practice. There's a panel conversation that we sort of envisioned as a way of broadening the conversation, not only across and through disciplines, but also to look at how gender studies is instantiated in different institutional centers across the academy. So we are really looking forward to the conversation today. Our first panelist will be Jackie Simpson. Jackie is the director of the Spectrum Center at the University of Michigan, which focuses on sexual orientation and gender identity. Jackie also teaches a course called Social Psychology in Community Settings. She earned her BA in Psychology and Spanish Literature and a master's degree in counseling education with a student development track. And she also taught a course, she's also taught at the American School of Mallorca for 6 years, early in her career in Spain. Okay. Jackie has spent the last 20 years working in the field of student affairs, focusing primarily in the areas of leadership and social justice education. So if Jackie could come over and present, and then we're going to go on to the second panelist. Thank you.
So I'm not really probably going to do a presentation in the traditional sense of the word, but then again, I've never been that traditional. First and foremost, I want to thank everybody who's hosting these conversations, and I'd also like to personally thank Lester Mons for asking me to join these conversations. He's been at every one of these for the past 17 years, and I guess brings somebody every time. But the other thing I would say about Lester is he, on our campus at least, is someone who's seen as doing more in the area of gender studies and LGBT issues than many women or LGBT identified faculty or staff. So I'm very much appreciative of his presence there. I want to talk a little bit about our center. We opened in 1971, so we were the first center at a university institution in the country that dealt with gay and lesbian issues, and the next one didn't come until 1977 at Penn State. Bisexual was incorporated into our center's work in 1991, and then it wasn't until 1997 that gender identity was brought into that center's work. Talking a little bit about what we do in the context of how we interact with the curricular side is, and I'm actually going to focus on our work that we do around gender identity, and I know that often sexual orientation and gender identity are talked as if they are one identity, and we actually see those as two separate identities, and certainly not that they don't interact or relate or connect, but if we're talking about single areas, we would separate those two, and in fact we would say that one's gender identity is before one's sexual orientation identity. So a couple of things is every year we probably do about 50 panels in our in coursework, particularly in classes such as sociology, psychology. But we go to places like engineering, the medical school, and we have what we call usually 3 or 4 individuals that will talk about their coming out story as it relates to gender identity. And we don't just have people on that panel who identify as transgender, but we also have people on the panel who might be considered stereotypically female or stereotypically male, because we also believe that everybody actually has a gender identity coming out story. We just haven't been asked to think about what that is. And so we encourage everybody, no matter where you sit, to think about what your coming out story is as it relates to gender identity. We also do a lot of work with faculty in regards to curricular enhancement. So for example, we work with the medical school in their 3rd year resident program to develop a curriculum and then consequently teach that to talk about and learn what it might be or how it might be, what kind of things you might want to know if you're a doctor working with LGBT students. Or a lot of other faculty members as it relates to inclusion of those concepts in the coursework that they're taking, or even as simple as the fact that pronouns matter. So we go from that all the way to the other extreme. The other thing is that I'll say is, so that's the kind of way in which we engage with the curricular side of the institution. One of the things that I'd also like you to consider is, there's certainly been very much an increase in bullying this year, and lots of younger people committing suicide based on bullying, and college students as well. But one of the things that I'd like you to think about is often those suicides and bullying expressions are usually framed in the context of, particularly with boys, as being gay. And what I would offer is when you look at most of those situations, it's really about their gender expression rather than their sexual orientation, that somehow the boys are acting too feminine. And similarly, the girls are acting too masculine. So to really, although we often will say it was a young gay kid, but when you really evaluate the situation, it's really about their gender expression. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about more and thoroughly is currently the conversation that's going on with a group of students on campus as it relates to developing a queer studies major. And they've started that conversation. They started that conversation first. I sent them all to Lester. And I said, go pick Lester's brain and figure out how, you might want to move this forward. And so part of that conversation has ended up happening with a lot of faculty who are teaching in women's studies and who teach LGBT courses. And what I will tell you is that they haven't been necessarily supportive of that idea. Currently, we have a women's studies major, not a gender studies major. And sort of the conversations that's been happening with current faculty that are engaged in those programs is about changing from women's studies to gender studies rather than to create a queer studies. But as all of you know, queer studies and queer theory is a whole different ball of wax, in that it's really more of a position than it is an identity, similar to when we use the word queer, which a lot of people find offensive, but a lot of people don't, is really about the notion of not buying into the normal of what exists or what is presented to us or what is determined by the dominant culture. So it's really, again, a philosophical way of identification rather than it is a social identity way of identification. And people sometimes confuse that. And so many people who might identify as queer or interested in queer studies programs may not be lesbian, gay, or bisexual. They could be very much straight or anyway, so I just wanted to put that out there. The other thing we were talking about, I'm trying to look at my time. Okay. I'm doing okay. I think I'm heading. So one of the other ways, we've been having a lot of these conversations lately, and some of them at dinner, in regards to what is part of the curriculum as it relates to women's studies and or gender studies. And wouldn't it be interesting if at some point we brought a group of current students together that were had multiple identities, and asked them what they really thought it was that they wanted to learn, or what would be most helpful for them as it relates to gender studies and or women's studies. And I would just be, I haven't done it, but it would be curious to me to know what it is that they would say. One of the classes that I teach, and this was mentioned, so you mentioned it about Michigan having the difficult dialogues, but we have a program on intergroup relations, and we have gender dialogues. And quite frankly, that's when a lot of men and women, quite frankly, are coming together and beginning to have open and honest conversations about the very things that I think some of you talked about as it relates to being in some of these classes, and either whether there's women bashing or men feeling more free to do what it is that they want to do, but really encourage people to really go back and ask from the very beginning of what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. And I would argue that I think those are some kind of the practical changes that need to happen in some of the gender and women's studies programs, is that there needs to be more experiential activities that men and women can have with each other, to dialogue about this concept rather than to listen about this concept. And anyway, that's what I think about that. The other reason that the students actually are interested in the queer studies program rather than a women's study and gender studies is because they see this as having more of a social justice framework. And what that means is really finding ways to include multiple identities and the intersectionality of identities into the conversation. It is true that many women studies programs include, and gender studies programs, including the one at the University of Michigan, are very white-centered in its framework. And it is often that students of color and LGBT students don't see themselves in those programs, that they participate, but they really aren't feeling that they're connected. And I'm reminded about when I actually was going to school and getting my bachelor's degree in psychology and remembering that the only people I was learning from was Skinner, Freud, all of which were terrific and I learned a lot from. But I remember when I found out about Carol Gilligan. You know, and I was like, wow, and I read it and I was like, yeah, okay, I'm connecting to that in a different kind of way. It wasn't that I wasn't connecting to the other stuff. I just was able to connect to Carol Gilligan in a way that I wasn't able to connect with Freud. And I would say that I think the same thing. Maybe that's why I'm a lesbian, I don't know. But anyway, that was the moment. That was the moment. No. But I think we're having the same sort of problems in our women's studies and gender studies programs, and that we have got to find a way to both honor, you know, the stuff that is there, and so support the stuff that was there, but that push it into a direction that might incorporate a little more flavor of multiple identity work. So I'm running out of time, so I'll finish there. Anyway, I look forward to the conversation, and thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. I look forward to the conversation. Our second panelist is Eileen McMahon. She is a professor here, associate professor and chair of the biology department at Westmont. She received her doctorate at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And her specialty is in microbiology and immunology, focusing specifically on neuroimmunology. So welcome, Eileen.
Good to be here. Very good to be here, actually. I have a disclaimer before I begin. And Omedi chided me when I told him, well, I'm not a scholar of gender studies. I am a student of gender studies. And the story I'm going to tell you today is a personal one. It's really my journey as a woman in science, and not only that, as a woman in the biological sciences, which might be different than someone's journey in math or physics, let's say. So I'm going to share my story and some my experiences early in my career, some trends and patterns I now see, talk a little bit of about my college students and how to engage in these topics and conversations here, as well as reflections on kind of what next, kind of how does this change how I work in the classroom and on my college campus. And I'll do my best to stay in time. My experience early in my career. Well, I was affirmed very early that I was very good at science. And this went through childhood, this went through high school, this went through college. As a freshman, I got into the coveted marine mammalogy class, and it was a great opportunity for me because I got to know the professor very well, and he asked me, along with another male classmate, if we would start this research project with him, a photographic identification of bottlenose dolphin in St. Petersburg Bay. And it's a project that still goes on. And it was such a wonderful opportunity to immerse myself in this amazing high-level research project and start it from the ground up. And then I switched projects a little bit later and started sequencing immune genes from the dolphin, and I was hooked. I just thought, this is the most amazing thing I've ever done in my life. I was good at it. Lots of people told me I was good at it. And I went straight to graduate school. So I went to graduate school at UNC Chapel Hill. And it wasn't even a hard choice to do. It was, yeah, of course I'm going to go to graduate school. My entering class in the PhD program there was 5 women and 1 man. And that was actually a similar pattern. The class above me and the class below me had the same sort of gender ratio. So I felt very much at home. I was successful there, went into a good lab, had a great experience, published papers, and graduated in 5.5 years. I secured a teaching position as a sabbatical replacement for a semester, actually here at Westmont, and then went to a postdoc at Northwestern Medical School, where I did have a home run paper, and sort of it was my sort of entry into the upper echelon of my subdiscipline, T-cell mediated autoimmunity, for those of you interested. I only stayed in that postdoc for 2 years, which was pretty short amount of time in the biological sciences, and I secured a tenure track position here. And I think my identity as a woman was a great advantage in my candidacy. I think we were looking for PhD women in my department at that time, and I was one, and I got the position. Obviously, here I stand. This was in 2004, and I think if you asked me at this time, here I am as an assistant professor, I would have said that my success and my experience in science was no different than my male colleagues or classmates. And if anything, it was an advantage. You know, it helped me get a job. It was an advantage when I was looking for a faculty position. You know, and I didn't live under a rock. I knew discrimination existed, but it wasn't anything that I thought personally happened to me. It sort of happened to other people in the sciences. But my dad always says, you know, he says, you don't get smart, you don't become wise until you're well into your 30s. And you know, it could be that us McMahons are late bloomers. That could be possible. But there is something to be said about an accumulation of experience and knowledge. Experience personally, experience of immediate acquaintances, readings, and that, you know, I did start to slowly see patterns and norms, societal norms, came into sharper focus and then were reinforced once you start noticing the patterns. More data comes in and they're reinforcing the patterns that you see. And so it is now with perhaps a different lens that I look back on my career and see experiences slightly differently, not as isolated events, but possibly as, you know, data points in the affirmation or, I suppose, denial of patterns. So what are the trends and observations I sort of now see sort of a little bit later in my career? And again, this is as a woman in biology. Well, first of all, many of my female scientific colleagues have dropped out of science or have chosen lower rank positions in lieu of higher rank. Remember those 5 women and 1 man in my entering class? Guess how many got their PhD in the program? The man and me. One decided, well, one did leave, followed a professor to another institution. I actually do think that she got her PhD, but she did leave. One decided she didn't want to run her own lab. That's what a PhD was going to enable you to do. So she left with a master's degree, is now working at the NIH as a technician. One left with a master's degree. She had gotten married. Her husband was a pilot in the Marines, and so she dropped out to go be with her husband. She raised 2 kids and is now a nurse. One left after an irreconcilable falling out with her male advisor. This was after she had finished her prelims, so she could have left with a master's, but she literally walked out and never came back. He said she wasn't dedicated enough, And she felt it was quite the opposite and was very hurt by that and literally walked out and never came back. She's a pharmacist now. You know, and this trend plays out in the literature, in the biological sciences. Women make up about 60% of biology bachelor's degrees, which reflects, you know, the greater population of college as a whole. If you look at PhDs in the biological sciences, it's about 50%, maybe a shy less. Some studies say a shy more, but it's about equal. If you look at postdocs, which is a necessary sort of step in my field, it's about 45% women. And it's at that point that it drops off sharply. A study at the NIH showed that 29% of tenure-track investigators there, we call them PIs, principal investigators, 29% were women. 19% of the tenured appointments were held by women. This was played out also at academic institutions greater than the NIH. In a survey of postdocs in 2007, only 50% of women postdocs say they wanted to be a PI, compared to 70% in men. And women largely cited demanding schedules, family and child concerns in this decision not to pursue becoming a PI at a research institution. And they said the position would be more attractive if there was affordable childcare, if there was flexible hours, if there was a part-time option, and if the job was near their spouse. Now, men also cited these as concerns or factors that would make the PI position more attractive, but women cited these concerns, these particular concerns, more often than men. Men did cite that a higher salary would be more attractive if the PI position had a higher salary, and that was higher than women cited that as a factor. Therefore, it seems that women are opting out at this postdoc level to make this final jump in the biological sciences to this research position or a faculty position. And I will say, you know, in graduate school, as, you know, my female peers dropped by the wayside, I just, well, yeah, that's their choice, though. They have a choice to do this. None of them were driven out of the program. Actually, many were trying to be persuaded to stay. And I thought, well, good for them. It's their choice. They have a choice. They feel that they're happier. But, you know, if both men and women have this choice, why is it the women that are leaving at the higher rates? Now, you could also argue that the men don't have the choice that women have, feeling that that's the natural trajectory for them. So the second and slightly related observation that I've made, and I can say this is a bad biological timing, because this is a fact. Graduate school, postdoc, tenure process coincides with childbearing years. Fact. And therefore, I've seen this scenario play out many, many times. Women in graduate school postpone having children until after they get their PhD. As a postdoc, they have children, and then they will leave science or opt for lower positions specifically because of having children as a direct result. And, you know, I just don't see that a lot of male colleagues feel this same tension. And there have been solutions that many institutions have enacted, solutions like stopping the tenure clock. And, you know, maybe this is a good way to go, but that interrupts productivity, and there's a taboo of accepting that option. And so in science, in this one study, and I have references if you're interested in any of this, 42% of women scientists say they came back earlier to work after the birth of a child for fear that if they didn't, they would be perceived as not taking academics in their career seriously. So feeling this pressure to have to come back early. 3, the third observation. I have noticed that women colleagues who have stayed professionally on the tenure track position sometimes are not thriving as much as their male colleagues. There's slower progress and projects. There are less papers. And this holds true in the literature. This editorial in Nature Immunology, citing many other papers, gave this long list. Women scientists beyond the postdoc level, slower rates of promotion, less recognition through awards, hold fewer department chairs, have lower salaries. Research funding success rates are the same, but there are fewer applications, request fewer years of funding, and ask for less money. They published fewer papers throughout their career, although, and this was an interesting paper, they were consistently of higher quality, while men tended to publish more of more variable quality. And I can show you how they measured this. And that women scientists had less administrative support, technical support, and greater burden of non-research activities, specifically teaching and administration. And obviously, this is at a research institution. And controversy in the literature remains about whether this is overt discrimination. But many would argue no. There's a lot of studies that show that women's papers are published at the same rate. It's just at a lower levels of submission, and that the peer review process does not disadvantage women. Instead, many attribute this to self-doubt and a lack of self-confidence. Women don't ask for the raises, don't ask for the promotions until they are more confident. They don't publish until the data is particularly strong. They don't submit grants until the preliminary data is accumulated. And evidence shows that men seem to take more professional risks in science, and that sometimes it pays off. You know, I see this personally, and this is still a little raw. Last weekend, I was talking to my sister and my mother about what I was going to talk about today, and mentioned some of the things that I just said. We were doing the quintessential feminine activity, shopping for a wedding dress. I've been engaged. And I was telling them about this, and then a little bit later they said, oh, you're going to work at UC San Francisco. This is where I was an assistant professor during my sabbatical. I'm going to go back there next summer. And they said, well, what salary are you going to ask for? And I threw out a number, and they said, what? You're doing exactly what you said women do. You're reinforcing the stereotype. And I got so defensive. And then it was like, well, am I? And so, you know, there's a real example. I wonder, am I? I don't know. I said, well, they're not immunologists. And so now I'm like, oh, I have to start asking some female friends to see if I'm right or they're right. So this plays out in different ways. So the fourth observation, women scientists, I've noticed, often are excluded from the informal networks of highly successful male scientists. This was very, very evident at UCSF. The immunology program there is top 3 in the country. This is the best research is really happening at UCSF. They would have these amazing seminars weekly. The male faculty would all sit in a row all together every week and would ask the majority of the questions during the seminars. And there were women faculty, but they were often absent, and they didn't sit with the men. And, you know, I asked, this was so perplexing to me, I asked many of the female postdocs, and they said, oh, yeah, this is how it's always been. And I said, well, how does that make you feel? And obviously not very good, right, that you're sort of being excluded. And certainly informal networks encourage success. Both men and women scientists have better success rates getting grants if they have a mentor, but it's more pronounced for women. 68% of female applicants who receive funding, females who receive funding, let me say that again. Statistics is very important to get the details, right? As Patty would tell me. 68% of female scientists without a mentor received funding, as opposed to 93% of females with a mentor that received funding. Does that make sense? And then women scientists do report a greater desire for a mentor, 71% versus 46%. So I'm almost out of time. What does this look like in the classroom? Now that I'm a professor here working with students, Sherry made a reference to a Harry study that we did here at Westmont, the Higher Education Research Institute study of 2006. That was very disturbing for many of us faculty here. That did show that it was a longitudinal study of the class of 2006, showing that between freshman year and senior year, women dropped in their drive to achieve, women dropped significantly in their perception of their emotional health, dropped in their leadership ability, their self-perceived leadership ability, and then were significantly lower than male classmates in self-confidence, both social and intellectual, and in self-understanding. And these differences were about 20%, but it could be as much as 40 depending on year and measure. And I do see this play out as I mentor and advise female students that said they were pre-med and now have switched to being going into a PA program, a physician's assistant, for this explicit reason that they want to have a family, and that seems like it allows more flexibility. Or female major honor students saying that they feel like they can't speak in their major honor committee meetings. All their male committee members had a tendency to speak over them, and that she didn't feel very confident as a result. Finally, and I'll sort of end with this, just as I think I was blind as a student to the ways that societal norms push us toward different gender stereotypes, I sometimes see that in my students as well. Recently had them watch a documentary on the discovery of the DNA helix. And I don't know if you know this story. We have Watson and Crick at Cambridge. We have at King's College, we have Maurice Wilkins and Rosalind Franklin. And of course, we know Watson and Crick made the big discovery. They published a paper, but they directly used data from Rosalind Franklin. Rosalind Franklin had taken this amazing X-ray diffraction picture, and Maurice Wilkins had shown it to Watson and Crick without Rosalind Franklin knowing, and that was the key for Watson and Crick making their model that was the real structure of the DNA helix. Rosalind Franklin actually had in her laboratory notebooks probably a double helix, but she never proposed it officially. And there was this one. Sorry, I'm a little late. There was this one moment in this documentary where Maurice Wilkins was describing Rosalind Franklin, and it was so overtly sexist. He was looking at a picture of a ballerina, and he says this. And this is Maurice Wilkins now. He's in his 80s. He says, "The picture to me seems to say something about Rosalind. Rosalind had sometimes seemed a bit heavy in appearance. Not always, but sometimes. I thought it would have been nice if she could have been able to sort of trip around on her toes and look pretty and cheerful. But I think it was very sad because we thought that we could have been able to work together on this scientific endeavor." I thought, oh, this is just so overtly sexist. Maurice Wilkins sort of projecting this feminine ideal onto Rosalind Franklin, and had students comment in an online forum, and I can show you some quotes to that, but nobody explicitly talked about this scene, and many were actually ended up being unsympathetic to Rosalind Franklin, who was portrayed as standoffish, harsh, competitive in the documentary. And yeah, I was very surprised. So we'll leave for some of my reflections on what next for during the discussion, because we can also all brainstorm about what next. So thank you.
Thank you, Eileen. That was really informative. I learned a lot. I'm going to read just because, for your sake, not mine. My talk is entitled "The Limits of the Theory and Practice of Gender, or What the Liberal Arts Cannot Do, What They Cannot Engender." I want to talk specifically of limits in several senses, in the sense of what exists and does not exist, in temporal terms and in moments or conjunctures, but also in spatial terms, as in boundaries and horizons. I want also to think of limits as involving all the senses, the visible and the invisible, what resonates and what doesn't, and what is pitched at a frequency below what we can pick up, the touchable and the untouchables, what we taste, eat, consume, and what we recoil from. And we think about limits in part by thinking through the question of subjectivity. And as a start, I want to situate myself here, and I'm speaking in the tradition of critical theory, and I'm interested in hearing your own traditions in dialogue with this. So I want to distinguish between 4 formations of subjectivity. And I'm speaking here of formations, not kinds. The first formation I want to map out is that of existential subjectivity. By this I mean the brute biological facts, what Marx called species being of a creature. I won't talk much about this because this is Eileen's forte, I think, but it's never too vulgar to repeat again and again those quotidian claims of the body, that the body feels pain, experiences pleasures, hungers, and desires. We've come to learn that conservative ideologies' attempts to construct subjectivity as transcendent, simply handed down from on high, is confounded by biology's entanglement in the long duration of history, such that if you repeatedly teach a subject in the very early years to throw a discus or javelin, to jump and run, the subject's modality or motility is that of transcendence. Well, if you constrict, corset, bind a subject, the subject's subjectivity is contradictory, inhibited, discontinuous. We've come to see that the oft-repeated mantra that sex tracks biological facts, while gender tracks cultural facts, is confounded not only by the imbrication of the social in the biological, but also by the complexity and diversity of biological constitution. For example, subjectivities with XY chromosomes, and at least some subjectivities with XY chromosomes, because they lack androgen receptors, they develop mostly along what is conventionally considered to be the female pathway. We know also of subjectivities that are intersex, that is, have a mixed sex anatomy. Historically, societies have stigmatized such persons as abnormal, as monstrous, as freaks. And they've tried to cure them. You'd think that with the liberal arts, with this interest in exploring the imbrication of disciplines, the sciences and the humanities, they would be at the forefront of complicating such conceptions of existential subjectivity. But by and large, I think you would be wrong. I think the liberal arts has traditionally often policed the boundaries of the human, and often by taking for granted the very idea of the human, or the privileges conferred on those people deemed as such, or even within them human, just taking for granted the idea of sort of a culture or cultural ranking. The second form of subjectivity that I want to talk about is what I will call the dominant or hegemonic subjectivity. That is how subjectivities are produced in and through institutional power. There are 2 dimensions of this subjectivity that I want to highlight. The first is how subjectivity can be an effect of power, produced by power. The second dimension is that subjectivities are always intersectional. That is, that the emergence of subjectivity is historically inflected by race, class, sexuality, disability and impairment, and nationality. Consider as a provisional starting point the transatlantic slave trade. Hortense Spillers has argued in an article, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, that the Middle Passage was a traumatic scene of engendering and degendering. In certain moments of the Middle Passages, captives were not only denied subjectivity, they were also inscribed as sheer flesh. They were denied even the idea of being a man or being a woman, right? And so the African American intellectual struggle, intellectual and political struggle, has been, in a sense, a contestation of the very meaning of gender, an attempt to map up how it's produced, for whom it's produced, and to whom it's denied. And nothing quite underscores in the spaces of theory the whiteness of theory than the subjectivities that it privileges. For instance, Irigaray argues that sexual difference is the greatest challenge humanity faces, greater than the problems of religious, economic, political, or racial differences. And this marks are out to be white, right? So it's only a white person who would say that, right? And think of the tripartite structure of Foucault's discipline and punish, its movement from torture to punishment to discipline. And then reflect on how this structure is rendered very white, not only in the shadow of the Battle of Algiers and in the wake of Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, but also by the United States disappearing of an entire generation of young African American and Latino subjects in its prison industrial complex, and the merriment that popular culture makes of prison rape. Now, the scene of subject construction is always carried out through the banner of moralism, and that's why we ought to be particularly critical of nationalist crusades, particularly when those crusades appropriate the struggles dear to us. Thus, sati or widow burning, female genital cutting, and the rescue of Iraqi women from Saddam are classic scenes in the production of gender. Iraqi women are engendered when the US administration is intent on the construction of Saddam as Hitler, and degendered in the Battle of Fallujah. The third subjectivity is what I call phenomenological subjectivity, and we've already talked about this, so I won't go into too much of it, but it's the qualia of subjectivity, what it feels like to inhabit a subjectivity. In critical theory, we have come to conceive of this dialectically. On the one hand, it's never been more important to draw on those differing experiences as we are doing right now. On the other hand, we know that experiences are always riven through with ideology, and we also often have to take a sort of critical view of experiences. My fourth articulation of a subjectivity is that of the utopian. That is, subjectivity is articulated in the interstices of the existential, the hegemonic, and the phenomenological. First, an understanding of subjectivities as articulated and constituted complicates our calls for inclusion. The problem with inclusion is that it does not account for the losses and gains of subjectivity. Let us think of the first loss from the perspective of subjectivities emergent from historical traumas such as the slave trade. What does it mean to be the kind of degendered and engendered subjectivity of being a slave? What does it mean to be a descendant of these kinds of subjectivities? There's a loss there that cannot be consoled and cannot be redeemed. What happens when we move to the forms of subjectivity engendered by being, say, a slaveholder, to the gains of transcendent subjectivity and the loss of ethical subjectivity of the slaveholders and their descendants? And this is sort of the burden of a work such as that of Toni Morrison, Playing in the Dark, right? Where she argues that when we talk about subjectivities in the great American novels, there's always what she calls a sometimes allegorical, sometimes metaphorical, but always choked Africanist presence. Second, a concern with utopian subjectivities must think hard about spaces not only for positive programs, but also for negative critique. I think the programmatic and the practical are important, but we should not foreclose subjectivities that are emergent. And this leads me to my third and final point. I think a truly radical theory and practice must engage deeply with the political horizon of critique. For example, in the short term, perhaps males must find a way of inhabiting masculinity in ways that are not as abusive, exploitative, and oppressive as these have historically been. But in the long term, a truly radical praxis must find a way for the abolition of masculinity and open up spaces for differences that are affirming of equality and worth. And I will say the same for even whiteness. We must try and conceive what it will mean to abolish whiteness and then to open up for queer subjectivities. Thank you. So let's break up for about 5 minutes and then come back for a question and answer period.